Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. The chemical DDT was banned 30 years ago, but if a scientist were to take a sample of your body chemistry, no matter how old you are, she'd find traces of DDT and other toxic chemicals. Now, before you change the channel out of despair, I'd like you to meet our guest because she's taking some very positive steps to make our world a healthier place. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Sandra Steingraber, an ecologist, writer, and cancer survivor who has combined her skills and experiences into a life of exploring the connections between our illnesses and our environment. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you.
You yourself were a cancer patient in your early 20s, and people ask if it runs in your family, but your answer surprises people.
Sometimes it does. I was diagnosed with bladder cancer when I was 20, and I wasn't the first person in my family to be so diagnosed. In fact, my mom and I were in treatment at the same time. She was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was in high school, and then by the time I was diagnosed, had metastatic disease, so her prognosis was always much grimmer than mine. My aunt went on to die of the same kind of bladder cancer that I had. I have an uncle in treatment for a rare stromal tumor, a couple dead of colon and prostate cancers, cousin with breast cancer. So there's a lot of cancer in my family. The punchline to my story is that I'm adopted. So what I share with my family is not chromosomes and genes. And so as a young biologist at the age of 20, after I was released from the hospital and went back to the lab, back to the medical library, I began to ask that question that all cancer patients do: why me?
Right.
But I ask it not necessarily in a metaphysical way, but in a biological way.
You wanted to know the science behind
I wanted
this.
to know the science.
Your answer, I mean, for people to learn that you're adopted is a really disturbing answer. That's a scary thing for me to hear because it means I can't simply write this off to biology. I can't, well, yes, I can to biology, but not to genetics.
That's right. I mean, I think there's a presumption that runs really deeply, not only in the lay, non-scientific community, but even in the world of oncology, which is that when we see cancer running in families, it necessarily refers to an inherited predisposition, that there's some susceptible gene that for reasons that we can't explain just goes awry and then you get cancer. Actually, to me, that's the more scary hypothesis because it means there's nothing we can do.
Okay.
Even whether we're adopted or not, we can't change our ancestors.
Sure.
But if instead the real story is that we're all born with a perfectly fine set of genes, but something, some chemical, some environmental assault causes them to break, there's everything we can do about that. We're the one putting chemicals into the environment. We can take them out. So when I went back to my hometown and learned that chemicals linked to bladder cancer are in fact in my hometown's drinking water wells, I felt like, scary or not, that's a place to begin to look at why there's so much cancer in my community and my family.
Yeah, yeah.
That was the more hopeful way of looking at things.
Do you think there's going to come a day, though, when we're all monitoring our air supply and our water supply and everything we touch and buy? I mean, or do we need to be doing that now?
I think I think we are, but we're not paying attention to that data. And I think there's a lot more monitoring we could do. But I am in favor, as a scientist, of redirecting our attention towards monitoring the environment. And it's the exquisite communion our bodies experience as we move through the world and take molecules of air, food, and water and rearrange them and turn them into ourselves. And then exhale and pee into the toilets of America. You know, that exquisite communion between our bodies and the world needs to be the focus of a lot more science, and we need to get away from this fixation on genetic testing and what's in your family as a way of explaining what's going on with us.
You do. I have to say that in your writing, which is so beautiful and compelling, I looked at Living Downstream. I meant to skim it quickly, get the science, get the facts, and get out of there. But there's a personal narrative in there that drew me in and that I couldn't come away from. And so I appreciated that. And the other thing that I appreciated and was just fascinated by is the way you teach science to us, that you describe these processes, these biological processes, in such poetic ways. The books are very useful.
Thank you.
You mentioned that it is possible to do all this testing, and that quite a lot of data exists now. One of the difficulties is that there's so much data, it's very hard to know how to interpret it, right?
Well, there's so little data that it's hard to interpret, actually, is how I would say it. In that, well, let me back up a minute. There have been breakthroughs in analytical chemistry that now allow us to measure pollution in people for the first time in ways that are fast and inexpensive.
So and you call that pollution in people the body burden.
The body burden.
Explain that to us.
Yeah, well, it just means that this changing kaleidoscope of chemical exposures to which we all experience on a daily basis from point of egg and sperm coming together all the way up through our adult lives, that inside our bodies, these exposures can be read as a kind of scroll. Some of these chemicals last a long time, like dioxin lasts up to 50 years in a human body, or the old pesticide DDT, which reached its peak usage in the United States the year I was born in 1959.
And so it's still in our bodies.
It's still in my body as a 50-year-old. There's less of it in my daughter's body because it was outlawed in.
Where is it? I mean, how does it? I understand how it could be.
It's in food. That's in food because it's that particular chemical is fat soluble, and so it finds its way into living organisms and finds its way into our bodies through food.
So this is just residual chemical that still exists in
the soil.
In the earth.
Yeah,
okay.
It's in the cows eat grass, cows make milk, we make butter. That's how it gets sent to us.
And
but
dioxin?
And dioxin is a similar story. It's in the same kind of category of chemicals. These high molecular weight, lipophilic organochlorines.
Where does dioxin come from? What is that?
Dioxin is an unintentional chemical. Nobody manufactures it. There's no market for it. It's made when we throw a whole bunch of garbage into an oven lighted on fire, as in a municipal waste incinerator or even a backyard burn barrel, so it's a combustion byproduct. Mm-hmm. So the molecules of chlorine and carbon rearrange themselves to form this very stable molecule called dioxin. So if you can kind of imagine what a bicycle looks like, that's what a dioxin molecule looks like. It has these two stable rings of carbon, which we call phenolic rings, mm-hmm. and it's held together. Dioxin means a double bridge of oxygens. That would be the kind of frame of the bicycle. And then there are a certain number of chlorines that, like flags that flying off the wheels, because you can imagine that's a very symmetrical molecule. It's very hard for our enzymes to get in and break it apart. So it lasts a long time in our body, but while it's in there, it's very bioactive. It can mimic hormones, it can alter enzymes. It does things to our body that raises the risk for cancer. Okay. And so those are those chemicals. There are other chemicals, though, like formaldehyde, that last a very short time in our body, but they cause genetic abnormalities as they go through. So for some of those chemicals, we can't go into the body and actually find them anymore. They're like hit and run drivers.
Oh, okay, so
they go and we pee them out. Yeah, but we can see the damage. We can go in and look at certain patterns of mutations or certain liver enzyme profiles, and we know that that's like forensic evidence mm-hmm. that a certain kind of harmful chemical has been here. So we have these tools now to go in the body and read the body like a scroll, so we can actually have our chemical autobiography. But what you're referring to is that once we have all that data, we don't know how to tell a person what it means,
right.
because we've used that scientific ability to measure so little that if we took, let's say, a whole toxic profile of you and measured your body burden and said, okay, Karen, here's your levels of all these different chemicals, and you'd say, wow, look at my levels of PCBs. How does that compare to most people my age? We can't tell you. We can't tell you if you're especially high, if you're especially low. All we can say, well, we've only done this to 100 people, and of those 100, you're sort of low, or you're sort of high, or you're in the middle. But we have no idea, and we don't.
And we also don't know how dangerous that is, right? That level.
And sometimes we don't.
Mm-hmm.
But what we do know is that the timing of exposure seems to be more important than the actual level of it itself. Okay. So it's the timing that makes the poison as much as the dose.
So in other words, at a certain age or stage in your
exactly.
development.
So we now know, for example, that among all of us baby boomers, we were the very first generation whose childhoods and infancies and adolescence corresponded with the introduction to a lot of synthetic chemicals that came onto the market after World War II. Right. So we're the first. Well, it turns out that if you are exposed to DDT prior to the age of 14, you can raise your risk for breast cancer as a postmenopausal adult woman by a factor of 5. But if you're exposed to the same amount after the age of 14, it has no effect. So, in other words, if the exposures occurred while the breast is developing, you have this rapid mitotic cell division, you have a lot of estrogen, that it has a very different effect than at post-development. So the new message that actually is coming out of this science is that it's not so much the amount you're exposed to, it's when in your life you're exposed. And to me, this is blowing up the whole presumption on which our toxic regulatory system rests. All our laws in the United States of levels, like if something is discovered to be inherently toxic, our law requires that we promulgate in the lab maximum contaminant levels. How much can a mammal be exposed without too much harm? And then we, instead of phasing that chemical out, or looking around for non-toxic substance, we allow it to be used, and then we police the result. We measure all these things, levels from everything from applesauce to lake sediment bottoms, and then we try to make sure that nobody's exposed to too much of it. But what that never took into account is that there are certain groups of us, not by genetics, but by how old we are, who are more vulnerable. Obviously, fetuses, infants, children are one group, but so are adolescents, because our bodies are being completely resculptured under the influence of gonadal hormones.
So much quick growth.
Very quick growth, and so we enter a period of vulnerability in adolescence where we're more vulnerable even than a child than to some certain kinds of chemicals, especially the ones that mess with our hormones. Yeah. And then as an old person, as we age, we lose a lot of the self-defense mechanisms, blood-brain barriers, liver enzymes, kidney functionings that help detoxify things.
So then we're more vulnerable again.
So we're more vulnerable again. Yeah. So my argument is that there's a human rights problem here. That we are actually discriminating against people on the basis of age. We're discriminating against the very young and pregnant women. We're discriminating against our teenagers, and we're discriminating against our elders. Because when we set these so-called safe threshold levels, we used reference man, a 150-pound middle-aged white male as our model for what's safe or dangerous.
Which seemed reasonable. I mean, one of the things that's so fascinating about science is you sort of have to build these models from scratch. And so what you're saying is really that our responses to knowledge aren't evolving with the knowledge.
What I'm saying is that our regulatory apparatus is deaf to the new science. There's nothing in the Toxic Substances Control Act that requires that we change these levels as new science comes forward to say, you know what, this is a lot more dangerous than we thought.
So the legislation was never very forward thinking.
It wasn't.
Okay.
Yeah. Now Europe has moved into an entirely different system, and so have other nations. So interestingly, we're in a period of history now where the U.S. is rapidly becoming the third world country where you can sell stuff that is illegal for use in other places. And the great example of that is cosmetics.
Yes.
So in 2003, the European Union decided that personal care products, shampoos, soaps, deodorants, cosmetics, should not contain any cancer-causing or birth defect-causing chemicals. Forget measuring levels, they just shouldn't be in there. So these kind of global companies phased them out for the European Union's market. But they're still legal for use here, so we get the lead in the lipstick here, but the European Union doesn't have any lead in their lipstick.
Here's a naive question. Why, if we know these things are dangerous, does anybody want to continue to manufacture them?
Well, that would be a question for the manufacturers. In some cases, it's cheaper to keep using the old stuff. In other cases, they got stockpiles of stuff. And so, but what we're seeing, whatever the reasons are, what we're seeing, whether it's kitchen cabinetry that contains formaldehyde that's being dumped here, and the manufacturer is making the formaldehyde stuff for the U.S. market and the non-formaldehyde.
Our houses are full of formaldehyde.
Yeah, but the European Union has a much stricter regulatory apparatus for formaldehyde. So, in some cases, you have Mark Shapiro, in his book Exposed, reveals this very clearly. In some cases, you have manufacturers making it to two different specifications, right? The formaldehyde stuff is directed here, and the people who live in countries that have stricter laws get the formaldehyde-free stuff. So the lesson I take away from this as a biologist is that it's not that they have different science or different data in Europe that we have here, or in Canada, whose pesticide laws are far stricter than they are on this side of the border. It's not a difference of science. We're all looking at the same data set. It's how protective do you want to be based on the always imperfect science that we have. Right. And so do you want to protect the vulnerable? Do you want to protect children or not? So, for example, in Canada, in many provinces of Canada, cosmetic pesticide use has been completely outlawed, meaning you can use pesticides to grow food, but if you're using pesticides
to kill the weeds on your lawn.
Exactly. You can't do that anymore. Whether you're an individual homeowner or whether you're, the city of Montreal and you have beautiful French gardens. And that's because their pediatricians took a look at the data linking pesticide exposure and children's brain tumors and thought, even though we don't have definitive evidence, we can't let our children remain in harm's way while we get better evidence. There is a reason to be concerned, and in the state of uncertainty that we're in, the morally right solution is to stop using it when we don't have to. At least not for cosmetic reasons, not in soccer fields, not in kids' lawns, and then let the data go forward. But in the meantime, we're going to protect kids. Where on this side of the border, we say, well, yeah, there's troubling evidence, but it's not absolute proof. So let's just keep using it until the proof comes in.
We're very inconsistent about that, because on the issues of, say, smoking and seatbelt use, we were, maybe quick isn't the word, but we established guidelines for those before we were absolutely certain that they were dangerous. And yet for things like global warming, the argument is made that we're not sure that we're at fault yet, so let's not worry about it. So yeah, we simply haven't been consistent. The other thing that fascinates and concerns me is that things like DDT has a place. I mean, in countries that are fighting malaria, DDT might be the lesser of the evils, but when it's used, as you say, for cosmetics, we don't seem to know where to draw the line.
We don't.
Or where to make the choice.
We don't. Although I would say what seems to be consistent is that we're far quicker in our in this country to tell individuals to cease and desist, stop smoking, eat fattier diets, put your kid in a car seat, make them wear a bike helmet. As long as we can direct the cease and desist order to the level of the individual, we're happy to do that. But when there are chemicals that are entering our common environment that we all share, whether, as you point out, it's climate changing chemicals, or whether it's pesticide residues that find their way into the food chain or into our drinking water, the cease and desist orders don't go out to our agricultural system. They don't go out to industry. So we're far less likely to regulate the for-profit world than we are for individuals. And again, I think that's a human rights problem. And there are other nation states who are far better able to regulate and put restraints on industry and agriculture. The Europeans just passed very wide sweeping pesticide laws, not just for cosmetic purposes as the Canadians have done, which we haven't also done, but they've done it now for food crops. So their argument is that organic agriculture, it can feed everyone without also giving everybody cancer and birth defects and endocrine fertility problems and all the other things.
Sometimes I feel so overwhelmed by the number of different forces that are working against us in our environment, right? I mean, do you ever just feel like throwing up your hands and saying,
I don't, but I'm aware that my readers do. And so I've had to actually recalibrate how I write as a writer, because I feel like I'm wired differently. And I don't know if it's because I had cancer at such a young age and I kind of brought this fighting spirit to my own self, right? because when you get that kind of news, and my mom, got it before me, so I watched her go through it. We don't just say, "Oh, this is so overwhelming, forget it, I'm not even going to bother with the chemo." No matter what your odds are, you go out there and you hope for the best, and you do everything you can. Leave no stone unturned.
Proactivity is the
Yeah, and you don't know what
thing.
the final outcome is going to be, but damn it, you're going to fight as hard as you can. So I don't know, maybe because I happened to be so young, and my mom always said, don't let them bury you until you're dead. And she was basically given a death sentence at 44, and she's still around.
Good. Yeah.
My mom's 78.
Oh,
She's a
that's
great
great.
grandmother now.
Good.
So she
Good.
beat all the predictions.
Yeah.
And so I watched her, and I went through it, and so here we are. And I just feel that I'm not going to bring fatalism into my activism.
Good.
The idea is, I'm focused on what is the science showing us, and if our policies don't reflect that good science. And if people, especially children, and my children, because I'm a mother now, are being exposed, and whose bodies are, in the language of human rights, are the repositories for toxic chemicals, which I see as a kind of trespass, right? It's a violation of our Fourth Amendment right to security of person. Then I, as a mother and an activist and a biologist and a cancer patient, I'm going to fight as hard as I can. I don't know what the final outcome is going to be, but I'm more interested in making sure I'm doing everything that I can, rather than feeling depressed. And paralysis is just
it doesn't
and it's just. It doesn't help. It's unhelpful,
right?
But I had to realize after writing Living Downstream, which made some of my readers just want to pull the covers up over their head and never get up, that so when I went on to write Having Faith, which is my book about becoming a mother at 40 and as a former cancer patient, I had to I changed it. I made it funnier. I put more of the science in the footnotes. And didn't try to, and I actually foregrounded the personal story. There's a lot more dialogue. Yeah. It's a less dense book.
Well, and I think then the overall effect of that is it's personable. They both are, but it gives you hope because there's a story of people there.
I think that's right. Yeah. I hope that's my intent.
Yeah.
So I hope.
Yeah. You were clearly influenced a lot by Rachel Carson's work. Her book Silent Spring in the mid-'60s was about 3 silences and was a call for the world to sort of wake up and pay attention. Can you talk a little bit about the book and about how you see its influence playing out over time?
My earliest memory, actually, is waiting for my dad to come home from teaching in the afternoon, and I would be allowed to walk as far as the end of our yard. My dad would walk home, and I would be overjoyed to see him. And then we would walk together, and he would lay his briefcase down and take out a copy of Silent Spring and lay it on the coffee table because it was his textbook. So I never knew what that book was, and I couldn't read the title, but it was a time when a lot of people were carrying that book around, so I learned to recognize the cover of it. When I watched my dad change our own garden into an organic garden and start buying, he would order away for ladybugs and praying mantises, and he put me to work selling organic tomatoes at the end of the driveway, mostly so I could learn how to make change and manage my money, But
this was part of what shaped you.
It's part of what shaped me, yeah. And so when I became years later a college professor myself and used this book as a textbook, I also became aware of the things that Carson and I had in common. She was also both struggled between trying to decide to study English literature or biology when she was an undergraduate. She was terribly concerned about the fate of the earth and refused to feel depressed about it, and thought, if the science shows us we have a problem, that's the good news. That means we have evidence and we can take action. And then she also had cancer, while she was writing Silent Spring, as I did when I had Living Downstream. The difference being that I openly talk about my diagnosis, and her personal story was absolutely hidden. It's one of the silences. It's absolutely hidden. And that, again, I think she hid it for very good reasons. She felt that if she revealed that she herself was a cancer patient, her science would be impeached on the grounds.
Like she's got an axe to grind.
Yeah, exactly. That she's too emotional or something. Yeah. And I'm happy to report that so far nobody, with one exception, has tried to write off my science, has found a problem with my science based on the idea that because I was so diagnosed, how could I possibly speak objectively about this?
But it's very compelling to think that part of the reason you write is because you want your children to be healthy.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And we all want our children to be healthy. So
and the whole generation, right, of that my kids belong to, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to hear this kind of optimism. The more we know, the more we can do, right?
Exactly.
Good.
Knowledge is power.
Great. Yeah. And And so we can all play a part in that, even if we're not scientists. We can be asking for more information and demanding better laws and safer laws, right?
And that's happening. I mean, I'm such a strong believer in science for the people. You know, the way of understanding science shouldn't be left to the experts. You know, anyone can understand science in the way that anyone can read a novel. Yeah. It's just another way of knowing the world. So my job is to try to explain the science to people in their own language, so there's no barriers, right? But then their job, I think, is to take that knowledge and to do something with it. We are in the midst of a global environmental crisis. This is the issue of our times. You know, in the way that I see my father's generation was to fight global fascism. That was his, you know, and my job and the rest of us and my kids is going to be to try to make sure we don't destroy the life support system of the planet and destroy ourselves in the process. It's a human rights struggle. It is the human rights. You know, what other people had to. Well, I'm a Quaker, so we have a long history of being involved in abolitionism and women's rights and things like that. So I see myself as just one person in a long chain of human rights activists going back to slavery, right? Who had to take up these very difficult problems where there were no easy solutions. I mean, divorcing our economy from slave labor was very difficult and took many years, and people lost their lives and risked their lives for Underground Railroad, you know, all this sort of stuff. In fact, my son is named Elijah after Elijah Lovejoy, one of the early abolitionists from my home state of Illinois, who was killed by a pro-slavery mob from Missouri. But nevertheless, abolitionism prevailed, right? And I think if we can get rid of slavery, we can become carcinogen abolitionists and say, you know, we're not going to regulate, just the way we didn't regulate slavery, we're not going to regulate cancer-causing chemicals, we're going to get rid of them and find a new kind of economy. We can do that. We can become carcinogen abolitionists.
What a great way to think about it. Thank you. My guest today has been Sandra Steingraber, ecologist, writer, cancer survivor, and author of Living Downstream, An Ecologist Looks at Cancer and the Environment. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.